I'd like to call the Lane County Board of Commissioners regular meeting back to order. It's Tuesday, January 30th, in the afternoon session here, and we have Public Works on the agenda here. Item 13A, Order 1801-30-08, in the matter of electing whether or not to hear an appeal of a hearings official's decision approving a legal lot verification and notice for 4 parcels within properties identified as assessors map and tax lots 1803, 1500, 00201, 00202, 00205, 00303, and 00300, Part and 304. File number 509 PA 1705220, and we have Raphael Seba, Senior Planner, and Lydia Kay. So, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. This item before the board is an appeal of a hearings official decision regarding a legal lot verification. Initially, the director issued a decision approving 6 legal lots. That decision was appealed to the hearings official. The hearings official evaluated the application and approved 4 legal lots. And the hearings official decision, in turn, has now been appealed to the Board of Commissioners, who has to determine whether or not they wish to elect to hear the appeal. The appeal criteria are set forth in Lane Code 14600 sub 3. That's the decision criteria to whether or not to hear an appeal. This application involves a complex history of deeds, unrecorded and recorded partitions, and the applicability of Lane County land division ordinances when certain deed conveyances occurred. Because of the complexity of this case, the planning director does not believe that the issues are of countywide significance or that they will recur with frequency, or that there is a need for policy guidance. The hearings official decision does provide guidance should a similar set of circumstances arise in the future. The planning director does not recommend that the board elect to hear this. The appellant has paid the option B, which is the less expensive option that explicitly requests that the board not conduct a hearing in order to enable them to go directly to LUBA, nor has the applicant requested that the board hear the matter. That's with that, again, the planning director recommends option 1. Happy to entertain any questions that the board may have.
Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not necessarily a question, but I'm trying to figure out how are we getting involved in these complex deeds? Downtown, you name it. I mean, there's these complex deeds all over the place that are occurring here. I think it's because they're older. And so, but anyway, it's just a comment more than anything else. I just find it interesting that you're not only hearing about deeds in downtown, you're hearing about deeds that are outside of downtown. And so I just think it's kind of interesting to see, but I appreciate that I think, you know, we've obviously seen some of this move through the hearings official decision, and I appreciate the fact that I think all above would like us not to hear this and just move it straight on up. So that's fine. When there's other questions, I'll wait until I put forth a motion. So thank you.
So I do have one question. The recommendation was to go with option 1, excuse me, which has us expressly agree and adopt the interpretations. And, you know, option 2 would have us remain silent. And to be honest, I do not have a complete grasp of all of the intricacies of these deeds and everything else that went into this decision. So asking us to adopt and affirm, expressly agree with the interpretations, is that really necessary, or is option 2? Can you explain the difference between our, you know, which one we do and how that moves forward? You know, because my gut reaction is to go with option 2 and remain silent because, one, I'm not an attorney and sometimes have to act in quasi-judicial matters, but this is a case where I don't feel like I know every in and out. So I see Andy step forward maybe to answer that question for me.
Back up Mr. Sevitt here, but.
Okay.
Well, I begin by saying that the primary difference between whether or not you expressly agree with the interpretations or whether you remain silent on the interpretations is a matter of whether the decision will receive deference with regard to local regulations. So the interpretations and the way that the order is written in terms of expressly agreeing with interpretations, it's interpretations of lane code. So it's looking at, say, the applicability of the early Lane County land division ordinances. That would be a topic where we could receive deference. But when you get into the function of certain deeds or the applicability of LUBA case law to a particular fact pattern, where those determinations are essentially directly looking at statute, the county wouldn't receive deference anyway. So by expressly agreeing with the interpretations of lane code, you give those interpretations deference at LUBA.
I agree with that. I don't have any concern. I agree with that entirely. The question, though, is whether there's much interpretation of local regulation going on in this decision, or if it's really a matter of applying sort of state law and, as Raphael indicates, precedent from LUBA or the Court of Appeals. I think it's fairly minimal. That is interpretation of local ordinance. So it probably doesn't matter too much either way, is my sense of it.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you, Commissioner. That was my area of inquiry also, but I had a little bit narrower question, and that is with the first motion, that's saying that we expressly endorse the decision and that we agree with it, and that the interpretations of the local rules are going to be given deference by people up the ladder. I get that, but what I don't understand is it seems like most of this is state law. So how much difference is there then between option 1 and option 2 if this is about state law?
I would agree with Mr. Clark that it's fairly narrow in terms of the actual interpretations of link.
And I think, Commissioner, as you just put it, I think LUBA on appeal or the Court of Appeals will give deference to any interpretation of the hearings official adopted by this board that is of local ordinance. If there aren't any, if the local ordinance are simply recapturing state law, or if the hearings officer was applying state law initially, then there won't be any deference. So,
Which is it in this instance?
sorry.
Which is it in this instance? Is it an ordinance that's being applied and there's no state law, or is it that there's an ordinance that's being applied but it's based upon state law?
I'll defer to Raphael on that one. He's got a better understanding of exactly what we looked at.
I'd say a little bit of both. The hearings official, one of the issues that came up related to roads, and so the hearings official did do a bit of an analysis on Lane Code Chapter 15, the roads, and whether or not a particular conveyance had the effect of, dedicating a road for public purposes, that kind of thing. So, again, I suspect it's pretty narrow, and I don't know. I mean, it's up to the board, if it's outside of the board's comfort level, to expressly agree with the interpretations to actually make that statement in the ordinance. Then you can select option 2, and we can come back with an ordinance that does not. But I suspect it's a bit of both.
At the end of the day, the reviewing body is only going to defer to things that it defers to. That is local interpretation of local code. And so even if you adopt, incorporate everything the hearings officer has said in his analysis, doesn't mean that the reviewing body is going to give heed to that, because it'd only be local interpretations they care about. And effectively, the decision is self-limiting in that way.
So any further discussion on, excuse me, agree versus remain silent?
I think we should go with 2. So I'll move option 2.
It's been moved. Option 2, is there a second? As the chair, I'm reluctant to second the motion, but I actually support option 2 also.
I'll second then for discussion.
Thank you.
I'll just say that this is really complicated, and that I think what the board is doing is affirming the decision so that both parties can appeal. It's really complicated, and so I don't want to take any more position than is necessary.
And that's, I'll just add to my discussion that if I wanted to understand that some of the local things like road, what qualifies as a road dedication, I would have asked for a public hearing versus elect not to hear. So if we're not going to hear, I'm more comfortable doing this as remaining silent on the hearings official's decision, and just moving it on to let Luba and those folks figure out, and because I like I said, without having to go back through the entire record, which is voluminous, I think, on this particular thing, and I don't think the applicant or the appellant want us to go through that record with any significance. I have trouble specifically agreeing with a decision I have not had the chance to go through thoroughly. So that's kind of where I land on this one. Some of the ones we've done elect not to hears have been very simple and pretty straightforward, and was very easy to say I agree with the hearings official's decision. And it actually had, but this one is far more complex and far more lengthy. So I would suggest maybe to my fellow commissioners that a remaining silent might be the better action in this. And I don't know if we necessarily have to come back with a separate order, or the findings attached need to be revised to support remaining silent. It seems like there's just one, piece of wording in the actual order that would need to be changed under the number 2, that therefore instead of expressly agrees with, remains silent to it. Or just, would you come back under consent next week with the order? Okay.
That's the simplest way. I mean, there's a possibility you could approve it today.
I was just trying to save you guys a return trip.
As long as it was clear. We'd have to read into the record what the wording for the order is.
Okay.
But if it's just general direction or to come back with an order and findings that are consistent with option 2, we can do that and put it on the consent calendar.
That sounds like what the motion was, so I'll leave it at that. So
Can you restate the motion that makes it sound like that? That's not what the motion sounded like to me.
I think you moved option 2.
Moved option 2, yeah.
Which is written out as move to modify the attached order electing not to conduct an on-the-record hearing for the appeal, affirm and adopt the Lane County hearings official decision as the final decision, and remain silent on the hearings official's interpretations of Lane Code, blah, 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 blah.
So we'd be voting on an order that's not really attached.
Well, right. If
It says to modify the attached order. Move to modify, and then they'll come back with the modified order in consent calendar.
Yeah, I think it's essentially that what this board wants to do is if option 2 is the way you eventually want to go, the order will be approved on the next consent calendar. That is not today. I think your head nod direction today is to come back with an order that's consistent with 2, and then when you adopt the consent calendar, if this doesn't get pulled off of it, you'll simply be affirming that order that will be drawn up consistent with option 2.
I would just say that indeed the order, the second now therefore, the last sentence says the Board of Commissioners has reviewed the appeal and the hearing's official decision and expressly agrees with and adopts the interpretations, and that will just be the change to and remains silent upon the interpretations. And then the final finding 17, same thing. It would just be changed from expressly agrees with to.
So you're not looking for a vote today then, just a head nod?
It'd be a vote on he moved option 2, so it'd be a vote on that motion.
You don't have my head nod, by the way.
So any further discussion on the motion to move ahead with option 2? Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Raphael, I don't want to put you on the spot, so I may defer here to Steve and Lydia instead. You seem to be comfortable with option 1, and because that was your recommendation. And you hesitated just a tad on option 2, and I'm just trying to get an idea of maybe. And here's my challenge, I think, with this whole thing is that, you know, we've had conversations about potentially looking at this issue as a whole, coming back and actually having a work session, a conversation about, is this something we want to continue? Do we want to modify it? It's written in code, it's written in state law, but it is what it is. And so my view is, I think the hearings official gave a pretty good interpretation about what's written in our code and what's written in state law. And I think at this point in time, that's where I'm trying to get. And so that's why I'm looking at the the manager of land management and the county administrator, obviously Raphael, staff. I don't want to put you on the spot here and get opinions, but I think it's worth getting an opinion from senior staff if they're comfortable with option 2, because I saw just a little bit of hesitation, but because your recommendation was absolutely option 1. So I just want to kind of get a feedback on this, because I mean my feeling is that some folks have made this out much more controversial than what it really is, because this is not an overly common practice. It's been used here in Lane County, and while it's maybe been used in Lane County maybe more than others, but come on, we're not talking about, you know, a 150 lot subdivision that's, you know, built out on a common practice here within an urban growth boundary. So that's why I'm kind of asking this question here before I just to kind of, for me to feel comfortable too, because I saw option 1 and staff seemed to be comfortable with option 1, but option 2 you kind of step back for a minute, may be perfectly comfortable with it, and that's why I kind of want to get your thoughts here.
Well, thanks, Commissioner Lycan. I would say that we are comfortable. I am comfortable. The division is comfortable with option 2. So if that's your concern, I'll put that to rest. I'll note that I think the primary reason that we recommend option 1 is in some ways it's that we sort of are supporting the hearings official in terms of his review and interpretation. But I think more importantly, where we can, when we can, we like to retain deference. And as Raphael said, there may be a little bit of that in this instance. However, you know, it doesn't sound like it's a really large piece of this decision. So if the board is more comfortable with option 2, that's certainly something that the department is comfortable with, and the division as well.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Any further discussion to the motion? So the motion was made by Commissioner Sorensen, seconded by Commissioner Lycan. See no discussion. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed?
No.
No.
Motion passes 3-2 with Commissioners Lycan and Farr dissenting. I'm dealing with 3.5 hours of sleep. My wife flew in late last night. So I apologize. So you have your your decision from us. We'll expect to see a board order come back under consent calendar. Thank you. So we'll move on then to item 13B, which is Order 1801-3009 in the matter of approving an intergovernmental agreement with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for environmental characterization of the Creswell closed landfill and authorizing the county administrator to execute the agreement. And we have Dan Hurley with our Waste Management Division and also Acting Public Works Director.
Thank you.
Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Chair Bozovich. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm here today to ask for your approval for an intergovernmental agreement with the Department of Environmental Quality. They are offering us $100,000 as part of this intergovernmental agreement, as they're calling it a loan, but it's a non-repayment of the $100,000. We could request additional funds beyond that, but I'm not anticipating that we would need to do so. This IGA would be to complete an environmental characterization of the closed landfill. So this property lies adjacent to the Creswell transfer station. It was originally purchased by the county with state funds with the intent that the gravel pits that were on the property would be filled with municipal waste. The property would be capped and then would be turned into a park. And so it was called Cinderella Park at the time, and it was operated as a park briefly after it closed under that name as a county park, Cinderella Park. The park's been closed for approximately 10 years due to funding issues with our parks division. And the city of Creswell is interested in acquiring the property and turning it into a park, sort of a natural park. And today in the audience we have the city administrator, Michelle Amberg, and the chair, council chair, Richard Zetterval. And they're excited to bring a proposal to the board at a future date to accept that into their city and turn it into a park. We did bring that proposal to our Parks Advisory Committee, and they've endorsed that, but that will be a future decision by the board. What I'm asking today is for us to move forward with an intergovernmental agreement with DEQ so that we can look at the property and make sure we're not potentially causing a risk to human health for the use of that park. There's a pond there, and the city would like to stock that with fish and promote fishing on the property, but we have not done any sampling of the fish or the water to make sure that we're not presenting a risk to users there. So this IGA would help fund that and allow us to move forward with the decision future by the board of what to do with that property.
So before we awaken Cinderella with a kiss.
So any questions for staff or comments? Commissioner Williams?
I'd like to move approval of the order approving an intergovernmental agreement with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for an environmental characterization of the Creswell closed landfill and authorizing the county administrator to execute an intergovernmental agreement with the DEQ for associated work.
Second?
So it's been moved by Commissioner Williams, seconded by Commissioner Lyken to approve the intergovernmental agreement with DEQ on the Creswell landfill. Is there any discussion to the motion? I'd just like to note real quick, this is another example of Lane County working collaboratively across governmental lines to the end goal of doing something good for our citizens. We got the cooperation of DEQ to provide this loan, and I say that in air quotes around it because we don't have to pay back the loan. I think it states that in the order a couple places. To do this environmental study of the landfill to see if it ultimately will be safe to transfer between jurisdictions, because there's always concerns when you have landfills. We all know that we've actually paid some considerable settlements in the past over aging landfills that we either inherited or had ourselves. So it's nice to see DEQ helping us do that work, but the end result is us working with the city of Creswell and advancing this idea of transferring it to be a municipal park where they'll have the ability to operate it for the benefit of their citizens and not remain closed due to our lack of resources. So it's kind of like this great collaboration with the state, the county, and a municipality all to try and have something good eventually happen for the citizens of Cresswell. So I really appreciate the work that Public Works has done in the background to get this moving ahead. So I just wanted people to understand that's, we're voting to approve an IGA. Ooh. Doesn't sound like much, but really what we're doing is we're executing some collaboration and collaborative work that our staff has done between agencies. It's really going to benefit some people in that South Lane area, really with a nice piece of property. So good work, Dan.
Thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think this is a really great example of leadership, and thanks to our friends in Cresswell for your role in this, and the Lane County Waste Management Division. Quick question, DEQ gets this money and they provide it in the form of this transfer to us. Where do they get the money?
They get the money from fees collected through solid waste disposal fees. So for every ton of waste that we take in at the Short Mountain landfill, we have to pay a percentage, and I can't remember what that is off the top of my head, that goes to support.
That's public or private facilities, so garbage dumps,
Correct.
Whether they are public or private, pay that state fee, and then this is some of that state fee.
Right.
Okay. Is there any precedent for us getting this kind of money in the past, and do we get our fair share, roughly, I'll say 10% of the tonnage in the state?
This is new, Commissioner. We have not applied for grant of this or loan of this type before. There's another one we are looking at to apply for, and the DEQ recently raised their fees, and they have more money to dedicate to, they're calling it materials management, to try to foster programs that utilize recovered materials from waste. And so we will plan to apply for some of those in the future. I'll be coming back to you very soon with some recommendations on the development of our solid waste master plan, and some of the projects that will come out of that are potential projects that could be funded by that.
I think that this this discovery, I guess I'll call it a discovery of this money, it underscores for Mr. Mokrahysky and our friends in Cresswell and anybody that's trying to get grant money that here's a bunch of money, the state has it, we didn't know they had it, but now we do know they have it, and we're asking for it. And I think it underscores the idea of having a person kind of in a bloodhound role of grant finder, because this to me is an example where it's a pot of money that the state's administering. We should, in round numbers, get 9 or 10% of that money almost all the time. And I think it shows that that money is out there if you know where to look for it. And it may not be that that money is expanding, probably isn't, but this to me is a great thing. And, you know, Tugman Park in South Eugene or Alton Baker Park or whatever, there's lots of examples locally of garbage dumps that were in need of rehabilitation, that have gotten some level of rehabilitation. And what was it, Commissioner Lyken? The U.S. Open was played on a
it was
on a landfill in Tacoma, Washington, that the county administered, and not only was it a golf course, but it was one of the premier golf courses in the country, built on a landfill. So I think that the point, the basic point that you're pursuing is great, but I think it underscores the business of, you know, and again, only the affluent can afford to find these grants. I suspect that the city of Cresswell has a lot of things going on in that little office adjacent to your city hall meeting place I've been to a few times. I mean, there's a lot going on there, and finding money that other people haven't told you about is kind of difficult. So I think that this is a role for us to play if we're the, you know, the bigger government, and we have maybe the resources to try to find that. But wouldn't that be great, Steve, if we could make a list of 10 grant sources that we have never applied for that exist? And then the question is, why didn't we? So, because I've been up here for quite a while, and I've never heard about this type of grant, and we've had this problem all over the county of what to do about all of these dumps that are out there. So, anyway, thanks so much.
Commissioner Leiker.
Real quickly, I just want to say how absolutely impressed I am that Commissioner Sorensen remembered that the U.S. Open was played up in Washington on a former landfill. And that usually would come from me. So, salute.
I have a son that's playing golf at the Olympic Club in San Francisco. So he fills me in on these details.
Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, as a resident of South Lane County all my life, I've been there long enough to remember when the way you got from Cottage Grove to Eugene was through Cresswell. There was no Interstate 5 when I was a boy, and so dates me, but it also adds a perspective because I've watched Cresswell grow over the years. But the role that Cresswell has been on for the last 15 years is just somewhere short of miraculous, I would suppose. They have revitalized their downtown. They have made downtown improvements. They have just a number of good things going on. And this is another opportunity to enhance recreation opportunities and just to explore the possibilities of where this will go. There are many, many good things happening in the city of Cresswell, and I just wanted to extend that. There are a great number of people that have discovered Cresswell from someplace else, and so there's a housing development in Cresswell that, to me, is just amazing every time I drive by it, because 20 years ago, you would have said, this is in Cresswell? The shopping center that they have created, absolutely first class, very enjoyable, offers just a little bit of everything for a small town. But I would be happy to call myself a resident of Cresswell. I'm happy to call myself a resident of Cottage Grove because that's been my home. But Cresswell is only 8 miles up the road, and I have great fond memories of where it once was and where it is today, and the quality of life and the enhancements that they have made that community is just miraculous. So with that, I think I probably didn't mean to polish apples, but perhaps that's the way it sounded, but I'm proud of that town.
Even though it's not the Cupertino of cannabis. Okay.
Oh, gosh.
Nice.
I compose myself for a minute here. So any further discussion to the motion? If not, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you. So that gets us on to, speaking of Cupertino, gets us on to item 13C, which is a discussion of the regulation of marijuana production. And we have Lydia Kay, our Land Management Division Manager, Steve Dingle, County Counsel, and I guess we're going, you guys have a presentation first, and then I will open it up for discussion and questions. We also have other staff in the room, I see, such as Mr. Kyler, if we have legislative questions. So I'll turn it over to you all to.
I'll take it off here. Chair Bozovich, members of the board, I'll start. First of all, I think we consolidated a number of board requests into one document. And you'll notice this is a pretty big document. And what we did is we tried to gather all of the information and all of the activity that this board has had around the regulation of marijuana and get it into one board packet so it was in one place. So first of all, Sarah Chinsky, Andy Clark, a number of other folks played a big role in this, and a lot of it involved going back and actually rewatching and looking at the actual board meetings where these issues were discussed. That's where you get the summary. And I believe as Commissioner Williams wanted a easy to read, easy to understand lay version of the history of the regulation of marijuana in general and specifically what the county has done. And I believe that we've achieved that in the first couple of pages. You can ignore the footnotes if you're not a total geek like me. I will say this, the overall picture is that, and I think Mr. Miller's prepared to discuss this too, in talking with other counties, you really walk a balance here. What's a reasonable regulation? I suspect that the type of regulation that you, the level and I don't know, severity is maybe the wrong word of the regulation that you would put on the growers to satisfy the residents will undoubtedly spark litigation from the growers and vice versa. It's just that seems to be that's the balance that everybody is walking across the state. And I think you see that from the memo and the previous discussions that we've had, a lot of these issues are really difficult to solve. I don't discount the citizens feeling uncomfortable about people walking around their adjacent property with, attack dogs, drones flying overhead and carrying, assault rifles, but there's nothing illegal about that. But that doesn't discount the fact that they feel uncomfortable about it. These suggested large setbacks obviously come with problems. You can imagine parcels where if you do 1,000-foot setback, there's going to be nothing left. And then there's the almost intractable problem of the odor. I don't know what you do when you heard a lot of testimony and public comment about these large grows, like the one that was the one grow and stuff. There's just really nothing you can do about that. It sort of is what it is. But I'll turn it over to Lydia and Kara to talk about some of the things that they've heard around the state, and then we're prepared to answer questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Dingle, and good afternoon, commissioners. I think Steve really did, Mr. Dingle, did hit on the challenge for all of us, and that is walking this fine line. We have done some more research, especially around the question of Measure 47 and where we thought there might be a little bit of clarity. The long story short still is, I think there is the possibility that if we do increase the regulations, especially in our forest zones, there may be we may be vulnerable to those types of claims. Mr. Dingle mentioned 1,000-foot setback, and that's something that was covered in the agenda packet as probably the most extreme setback that we've seen around the state. Just so you know, and I think we've talked about this before, statewide, I think Lane County did adopt time, place, manner regulations that many other places didn't. So we do regulate, we do have a setback of 100 feet. We regulate lighting, and that's something that we have relatively easy ability to enforce because that's something you can, a photograph can be taken and we can get back in touch with those people and say, yes, you need to not have any light going off of your property. Odor is a really challenging one, obviously. Even with the setbacks that we've seen in other places, I think that can still be an issue. If the board wants to consider adopting regulations to apply to medical marijuana, that's certainly an option for the board. Right now, our regulations apply to apply to recreational. The only other sort of thought that we had that was covered in the agenda cover memo would be a consideration of whether the board wanted to adopt some regulations, as I think one of the counties has, that essentially precludes the growing of marijuana on properties that are adjacent to residentially zoned land. It's in those areas, obviously, where we have residents that are impacted, and so that would be one way to address that. Again, whether or not we'd get pushback or legal challenges from growers or from people who have property is really yet to be seen. Before I turn it, I think Like I say, I don't have much to add to that at the moment. I think what we're really looking for is discussion from the board and direction. If you would like us to go in a different direction, it would require us modify our code, obviously. That would be, if we do go in that direction, then we would certainly have public comment. That would be part of the procedure. Kier is aware of a legal case that's pending at LUBA right now, and that once that case is heard, we actually may have a little bit more information in terms of how the state might look at what are reasonable regulations, because again, that's the language that's written into the law, that counties can adopt regulations, but they must be reasonable, and that's another one of those wonderfully subjective terms that nobody really knows what it means until we go through all kinds of case law. So I don't know if Kier has anything to add to that.
You covered most of it. The case that Lydia, Ms. McKinney is speaking of is Ms. Kay, I apologize, is in Deschutes County, and I understand that that hasn't yet been heard by LUBA, but they've recently amended their time, place, and manner regulations, trying to strike that balance. They've indicated that there are challenges on both sides, from neighbors who want to see stricter regulations, and of course from the industry that doesn't want that, and that was sort of the balance that we're discussing. So that case may give us some indication of how the state is viewing what reasonable is for time, place, and manner. The other piece that I'll just mention quickly, and it's mentioned in the memo, is beyond trying to amend our existing time, place, and manner regulations, there's the issue of code enforcement with existing regulations that are on the books. And we do currently have one compliance officer, and we're in the process of recruiting for another position. And it's much of that is a matter of how the board chooses to prioritize the work of the compliance staff. Right now, they sort of focus on the most critical life safety issues. But that is an option. There are certain, some of these grows have noise violations and other light contamination and issues like that compliance staff could potentially go after more vigorously if we had that direction and resources.
I was just mentioning to Ms. Kay that, based upon the complaints that came in through public comment and through some of them that came directly to my office and some of them that were forwarded from you, I think we would expect that, I think we saw during the fall, there would be a lot of calls for that inspector those inspectors to be handling marijuana-related complaints, because that would seem to be the peak. That appears to be the peak time for complaints about the whole process, just because of what's going on.
Commissioner Sorensen.
I understand that that there's been some change in the number of people growing medical marijuana, and that it's gone down because of the regulatory ease of growing recreational marijuana. Is that true? And are we building a regulatory program around an activity that's really on the decline in the medical marijuana? Can you comment on that? Or
I can just anecdotally, and I think just as you made mention of, we have heard that some of the people who are growing medical marijuana where there are more restrictions may have switched over to recreational. I know so I think that is happening. We don't have any specific data on that. That certainly may continue to happen. I know one of the things that we've discussed, and I think Chair Bozovich brought up, was an idea of whether the state, and I think again some of these issues may best be addressed at a state level, sort of puts both of those into one category. It certainly would simplify things from a regulatory standpoint. That hasn't happened yet, but if the board was interested in that.
As it stands now, do we have a separate regulatory program for recreational marijuana and medical marijuana? And are there differences in the way it's grown? I hate to sound so ignorant on the topic of marijuana. Someone my age should know a little more about marijuana than I do.
Chair Bozovich, Commissioner Sorensen, I think I can handle that. We, we in the county don't have a different program. Really, and this really does, I think I talked about this earlier, one of the real frustrations for the citizen out there is that, yes, at the state level, there are different rules. Now, medical can sell, I believe, up to 20, I think they can sell up to 20 pounds per year into the recreational, if they have surplus. But that's part of the citizens' frustration is that you have two different agencies that regulate the two different types of grows. And that's you don't know necessarily when you're feeling the impact what's happening. Now the state has done something to mitigate that in that they are going to give, I think I mentioned this earlier, we will have the ability, I think we've designated Ms. Lockhart, right? Our code enforcement officer is the person designated from Lane County that can call with an address and get an answer and find out at least whether or not it's a recreational commercial grow, which is regulated by OLCC, or it's a medical grow, which is regulated by the Oregon Health Authority. And again, there's different rules. Obviously, there's different growing limits, but with card stacking, it's quite frankly, it's about as many cards. I mean, the only limit really is how many cards you can get. So
are you guys recommending anything here? Any changes or what do you want us to do?
Well, I think we're really looking for direction from you, obviously the board. I think my understanding is that one of the reasons that we're having this conversation is because there was, especially around the One Grow operation, comments from the public who were asking the county to do more. And so I guess if I was pushed to make a recommendation, if the board is interested in increasing the regulations around marijuana, what I would suggest that we do is see what the state finds on the Deschutes County case, because again, I think that's going to give us some direction and maybe some certainty in terms of whether there are the reasonableness of the regulations that Deschutes County is looking at. If those pass muster through the state under this opposition, then I think I would be more comfortable directing the board to move in that direction. My trepidation at the moment just is there is so much uncertainty to go through the whole code update process to adopt new
When is that going to get tested? How far do you think it'll go in the system, this Deschutes County ordinance?
I don't think we really have a good sense of that because
is it being appealed to LUBA now?
It's on LUBA's. But it's not.
We have a guess. Time guess? No.
3 to 4 months, maybe.
Okay.
But then they would have the ability to appeal to the Court of Appeals.
Yep.
Which would be preferable for us because then it would have precedent setting. If it's just LUBA, it's not precedent setting. Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so the agenda setting, we're having this conversation regarding this. And I want to say thank you to Alex. I know he checked in with Rob Bovet a little bit today. And Alex, do you mind coming up and maybe just talking a little bit? Because what's helpful here, and again, this is a pilot, and it has to be passed by the legislature in 2019. I think that's where Rob's going for. And the pilot is it 5 counties, Alex?
5 counties.
5 counties, southern part of Oregon. What this does is establishes a business license program, if I think correctly. Yeah. But again, pilots have a tendency to last 2 to 4 years. And so if this is even passed, it's 2019. I think there's a good chance it will, just to kind of establish that. We're talking 2023 before you get to see any sort of concrete evidence of what the potential can be here, because a business license could clearly establish some things for the local government. I mean, that's my view. I mean, first of all, it's recording some things. On top of that, I think it's opening door to potential from a regulatory standpoint, but also it's a revenue piece. And so I don't know if you want to add more to that, Alex, but at least there's something they're thinking about. But I would agree on the Deschutes County piece as well. That's probably a little quicker to provide some information. But anyway. Thank you, Mr. Kyler.
Sure. And Commissioners, my overall observation is that the the legislature doesn't fully appreciate, I think, some of the challenges that
No doubt.
counties in particular are facing with respect to land use. We are not, and we don't have a really clear path forward with respect to the funding from the marijuana tax. Now, that said, we did get a win in 2017 under Measure 91, if you recall. The allocation that went to counties, the 10% of the state tax, was designed to be used only for public safety and only for enforcing Measure 91. We managed to get rid of that language so that those dollars are now completely discretionary. So that was a good thing. But personally, I think when you compare the amount of dollars that the county gets from the local tax that we went to the voters with to what the cities are getting, for example, I mean, it's just wildly out of parity, and we have a lot of many challenges that the cities do not face. So that is probably something legislatively we need to continue working on. I will say in this coming session, I've seen 2 bills thus far relating to marijuana, with relating to clauses relating to marijuana. So they don't address this issue, but they are bills that are very broad in their relating to clauses. With respect to this pilot that I have seen some wind of in terms of getting it ready for the 2019 session, there's a criteria whereby the members of the pilot would include hard-hit counties. And so there's sort of a litmus test of how much revenue you had received from timber revenues versus your general fund revenues. And in that calculus, we miss the threshold by a fraction of a percent. And so I think the challenge for us, and actually specifically for you, commissioners, as you're hearing about this at AOC, we may want to do some advocacy, because I'm not sure, actually, I showed the numbers from the criteria to Christine Moody. She didn't think they were accurate. So it may be that we just need to get some better information to the crafter of the measure. But as Commissioner Lycan said, the idea there is that these hard-hit counties would be able to assess a fee on processors and growers. As you recall, our local tax is just assessed at retail. So this is a way to get some additional revenue in that's sort of closer to the problem, if you will. And as far as I can tell, at any rate from the pilot, the money would be completely discretionary, so the county could use it for purposes like what we're seeing with nuisance enforcement and whatnot in our county.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Alex, you can stay if you'd like. I'm going to talk about item E, which is health implications. You know, we're talking about revenue, and I'm personally interested in pursuing the strictest possible regulations that we can place around this as it pertains to the health of the people who are living around the grows. You know, the testimony we received on the Grow One, is that the right place, Grow One?
One Grow.
One Grow, thank you. Was pretty alarming, and the people weren't lying. I could tell they weren't lying, and they corroborated each other's stories. So for me, the most important element here, the revenue part is a dream sometime in the future, maybe. However, the health implications are here and now, and as we sit here in this room today, it's happening in our county. So I think the sooner that we can move forward on as much regulation as we can surrounding the public safety and health implications in the neighborhoods that this is taking place, then we need to move as expeditiously as possible. So no, I'm not giving you any instruction there. Just do it, okay? And then come back and tell us what you did. I know we've been looking at it, and we really seem to have our hands tied. And back when I was chair, I said, I'm interested in finding out what we have both the responsibility to do and the opportunity / authority to do. So, and I'm not really seeing any answers to those questions at this point in time, other than, well, there's not much we can do. So, and I guess my question to you, maybe Alex to you, maybe to you, Mr. Dingell, is, are we waiting for other counties to step forward and test the water on health implications and public safety implications?
Chair Bozovich, Commissioner Farr, I think we've, as Ms. Kay said, I think we have, there are some counties, believe it or not, that it is completely unregulated. I would describe those as sort of the Wild West. We are certainly in the middle in that we have done some regulation. I think the sense from the land management folks is that Deschutes is really pushing the envelope. They're going as far as they think they can go. And of course, look what it's done. It's drawn litigation. One of the things that we certainly one of the things that I had in mind, having listened to and sat through a couple of different sessions on this, when we prepared this board packet, one of my goals was to give you, as well as your constituents, a good understanding of just how complicated this area is. I know that everyone, and I certainly empathize with the folks who, we heard the typical story is they were there first, a marijuana person moves in, and now it's impacted their quality of life. But I wanted folks to understand that it's not just as simple as passing an ordinance, like I said, with 1,000 or 1,500 foot setback and no more than a certain level of odor and all these different things and making it go away, because there is, and again, whether folks like it or not, the voters voted this. I personally think that they did not think through the consequences. And I think the state is reluctant to tackle these, and so as it sort of goes downhill, the thorniest issues, as it almost always ends up on your lap, with a fence put around it by the state, which is a very difficult position to be in. But I do think if you get inquiries from constituents, I urge, that's why we made this comprehensive package. I know it's a lot of reading, I know it can, but we did, at the request of the board, make it easy for a layperson to read. And I think if you read the narrative of this, I think even though you may have strong feelings about it, I think you can get a pretty good sense of the limits that are placed on the board.
Then, Ms. Kay, you mentioned the word reasonable. And how much of this is hinging on what somebody's definition of what reasonable is?
Well, that's the word that is used in state statute that says, it specifically says counties may adopt reasonable restrictions.
And it's not preempted by the Right to Farm Act.
It is not preempted by the Right to Farm Act. That is correct. So the question really is, what is reasonable? And I think when we first adopted the regulations, we were probably out in front looking at those regulations. Since then, other counties have adopted similar regulations, and then places like Deschutes County are trying to push that a little bit further. So that question of what is reasonable is something that a reasonable person can answer. Now, it's really difficult to put parameters around that. Is a 1,000-foot setback a reasonable condition? It is something that has been adopted in other counties. Will that address the odor issue? And I think that really is something that I would want us to be able to do, is if we adopt these additional regulations, to be able to say that, yes, these are going to make a difference. I guess that's one of the reasons why I think looking at properties that are directly adjacent to residential may be something that is worth some consideration. Will that address all the situations of complaints? Not necessarily. Are we guaranteed that we are not going to receive litigation from that? Not necessarily. But again, if the board believes that we should be, as you say, taking the strictest, making the most strict regulations that we can, then we can go further than what we currently have done.
And Chair, and risk litigation unless the course of law that have the questions answered. I had a guy come up to me the other day in a very reasonable fashion and said, if you adopt regulations, I'm just going to go back to black marketing. So, that's the kind of mentality that we're up against with this, is that people are ready to do it legal, illegal, whatever it takes to put their product in people's hands.
Chair Bozovich, Commissioner Farr, and reasonable, it's the most overused word in the law. And I guarantee you that if you ask, and the 1,000-foot setback is a great example. You ask the growers if a 1,000-foot setback is reasonable, they're going to tell you it's unreasonable. You ask the residents if a 1,000-foot setback is reasonable, they're going to tell you absolutely it's reasonable. which really is difficult for bodies like you, because I think all of us would like to come in and be able to give you if there had been some greater guidance provided, a more definitive answer. But really, unfortunately, this is one of those things. Almost always when something is defined by reasonable, it gets defined by court decisions, which take a long time to flesh out what is reasonable in a given circumstance. And that's just the way it is.
And believe it or not, court decisions are fairly subjective. No, you don't believe that.
Having a couple of cases in front of the Court of Appeals right now, I'll take the
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you.
And then I'll put myself in.
Just curious, in terms of the types of conflicts that come up with marijuana growing, I heard a lot of, in those public comments, well, there are people that are scary and they have, automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons. It seems to me that that's something to listen to, but it's also something to say, well, there's other laws dealing with menacing or whatever. But are there actual, is this all done indoors? Is it all indoor growing, or do they use helicopters? Do they use airplanes? Do they use backpack sprayers? Is it like a lot of handwork, or is it machines, or maybe we should go on a field trip or something here. I don't know. You guys can go on a field trip.
Well, I can tell you, the only thing I know is that when I compare the type of operation that is done commercially, I believe it was One Grow that they have the drone fly over that gave you, I'm going back to my days as a drug prosecutor where it was a little less sophisticated and quite different. Now they are at least the One Grow, it was in an pots.
Outdoors, though.
Outdoors.
Yeah, it's not just a...
They're not using machinery like in my youth, hay balers and bucking bales on the back of a 2.5-ton truck. There's no handwork like that.
No, again, this is strictly based on what was reported in the paper. It appears to be a very labor-intensive operation because part of what was reported in the Register Guard was hiring these people to do the clipping and the trimming and put it in the dryer. And there was a recent article that the owners of One Grow
Got to get out more. I really do have to get out more.
There was an article in the paper that they had borrowed $400 and some thousand to pay wages that they had not repaid. So it is not no, there are not windrowers and combines out there.
Yeah.
The stuff down.
What about the spraying to kill the weeds? How do they do that?
There's no federally approved herbicides or pesticides for marijuana. So in order for them to maintain certification for human consumption and pass some of the state tests, there's very little spray done. Just because the federal regulations won't let you approve a pesticide for them because it's not a legal crop. So therefore they're stuck in this catch-22. So there's almost no spray utilized.
There's a lot of hand labor involved in this then. Yeah.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
I would just say, some of the other sort of impacts that we've heard, obviously there is a noise concern that we've heard, and that's mostly around generators because in addition to having outdoor grows, growers will also use lights in greenhouses to supplement. Odor has obviously been mentioned. Increased traffic is a concern. There's often a concern expressed that these grows bring a bad element to the community. Of course, there's light pollution is a big one in the nighttime when these I've seen them on I-5. These glowing greenhouses are pretty noticeable. So those are kind of some of the other concerns we've heard.
Thank you very much.
And I would say the final one that I have certainly heard expressed is the, and I don't know how to put this, it would be the on-site, the fact that people are living on-site, not permanently. So you have a 25-acre parcel, and at some point you want to have people there all the time. So there are people who are camping or living in a trailer or doing something for 30 or 40 or 60 days. We've also heard that complaint.
Is that abusing their current zoning? Are they
Usually.
lawfully doing that, or are they
lawfully doing it and creating problems, or not lawfully doing it and creating problems?
In some of the circumstances that have been described to me, it is unlawful.
Oh, okay.
And whether or not they're causing problems, that's certainly in the eye of the beholder. But I've personally received complaints from neighbors about that, alleging that there's a parcel without a dwelling on it that has people, quote unquote, living for an extended period of time.
And most of these situations are resource lands where there's not a legal dwelling there, and then people are throwing a camper on there because there's security issues with a crop that has that high of a value. So they want to guard it 24/7, so they put people on site when there's no legal dwelling, which means they don't have legal septic and other issues, and that's been an issue that I've run into several times, and in particular because even the original omnibus bill 3400 precluded marijuana revenue as being able to prove an ag dwelling, count as agricultural revenue to get a dwelling on a piece of ag exclusive farm use land. So you can't even, you can't do that calculation and get a dwelling on a piece of land that doesn't have one. So that has been a big issue. So speaking of bills and all that stuff, House Bill 3460 was, medical marijuana kind of got the cat got let out of the bag, so to speak, and specifically preempted us from doing any time, place, and manner restrictions on the grow side. Allowed us to do stuff on the sales side, the clinics, but nothing on the grow side. And then along comes Senate Bill 1598. House Bill 3460 was 2013. Senate Bill 1598 2016, and it allows us to do time, place, and manner for medical. And of course, it's got the reasonable stuff in it. But my question is even if we pass the reasonable test, does that still make us liable for a Measure 49 claim because somebody had the ability to use a piece of property to a high value of growing, say, medical marijuana in rural residential, and if we prohibit it or change that use, are we going to, even if that prohibition or change in our conditions is deemed a reasonable restriction, is it still set us up for a possible Measure 49 claim?
I think that question is going to be addressed by Councillor Clark.
I will weigh in.
Not as clear as we originally thought.
I don't think the question of whether or not, or the issue of whether or not it's reasonable will have anything to do with whether or not there's a successful Measure 49 claim. Reasonable or not, the claim may be there.
That was my answer.
Somewhat oddly, or perhaps surprising to me, because I didn't have much opportunity to look into Measure 49 earlier, it applies very limited, its application very limited on EFU land, and so by and large there wouldn't be the right to a Measure 49 claim for regulation of EFU land regarding marijuana, in part because it doesn't apply to much. I think the only thing on EFU land that Measure 49 applies to is clear water regulations, and that's just a peculiarity with the definition section in Chapter 195, which is the stuff that deals with Measure 49 claims. Oddly, that's not the case with forest land. I think F1 and F2 land, you could have Measure 49 claims if you change the regulations and reduce what folks could do with forest land. The 195-305 is the general statute that deals with compensation for reduction in value for regulation, and it applies to land use regulations, an important term. It restricts the residential use of private property, so it's a lot about residential land, or a farming or forest practice, which sort of gets to what you're talking about. But then when you look up what the definition for land use regulation is, there's a laundry list of regulations that are encompassed within that term. The only one that relates to EFU land is, which one is it here?
It's 14F.
I think it's F, right, which talks about, it just lists the laws there that it wants to include in land use regulations, ORS 561, 191, and a few others that follow. And as I say, those all relate to the Department of Agriculture's regulation of the clean water laws, basically. And so that's the limited situation in my understanding of Measure 49 of where the overlap would be between 49 and potential regulation of marijuana stuff. So pretty limited, I think.
And remember that the availability or the available land that is on F1 and F2 land allows, and the county's escaping me. Where's the marijuana case? Was it Jackson County? Is that the one I'm thinking of?
Yeah.
Jackson?
Yep.
Remember, they upheld the restriction of prohibiting medical marijuana grows on rural residential because they said there was enough land in the F1, F2 inventory to essentially not outright prohibit it.
Which is similar to what the stance we took here, is there's so much EFU, F1, F2 lands that, restricting it from rural residential was a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction because of the conflicts that occur. So that somewhat answers my question. And what's interesting, it seems like the only place we could regulate a crop is on the actual land that's designated for growing crops.
Yeah. It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, our state land use laws. Yay. That kind of, what's interesting to me is the medical is going to change anyway, because this year seed to sale is required for medical grows where they actually are somewhat going to be regulated by OLCC. Not completely, but they at least have to do the reporting of seed to sale inventory control, which is, I think, going to severely limit the medical growing industry because the medical grow side's way overproducing and a lot of their stuff's being diverted, and seed to sale tracking is going to make it difficult for them to divert and make their money off of that diversion. So I wonder if we're going to see a collapse in the medical grow side completely in the next year or so as they have to deal with that seed to sale tracking. The two things that are interesting to me, you get I have one particularly out off of Central where I've got somebody that's leasing parts of his property for grow operations, and they're not really regulating who they lease to and how the lease people behave. That's been a big issue, and we've got the one grow down in Cresswell. Those are kind of the exception on ag land as far as complaints go. I've got a grow up in Junction City that's on ag land that hasn't been an issue. I've got one right around the corner from me in Elmira that's on ag land that's been fine. It's kind of how people choose to operate somewhat. People aren't extremely happy, but they're not suffering the problems that we're seeing on these other places where we've had illegal ponds dug to water crops on one situation. We've got all the other noise and odor issues down there near Cottage Grove. But the one thing that we haven't talked about a little bit is my biggest complaints have been the medical and residential. So one of my interests in asking for this was what was my ability to do time, place, and manner of medical, and some of the questions around Measure 49 claims make me extremely leery of stepping into that area. First, you got to go through the test of whether it's reasonable, and then whether I've actually impacted somebody's value. And it is residential property, so the claims could be there. And I don't feel like exposing the county to a huge unfunded liability. So I'm kind of reluctant to step into that area. The other issue was there is, on the other side of the fence, I've had legitimate growers talk to me about the fact that our complete prohibition in residential has actually limited their ability to be functional, because the medical market's fallen apart, and really their only choice really is to either grow black market or they're they really don't have any value there. And some of these exception parcels, one of them's an RR that's at the end of a dead end and is surrounded on 3 sides with F1 land. You know, so, and is a fairly large parcel. Another was the one outside of Springfield that was 26 acres and would have ability maybe to set back. So there was some discussion, should there be some kind of special exception process to allow recreational grows in RR zonings? And conversely, to me, I was thinking maybe there ought to be a special exception process to allow medical in RR, but then we start getting it. So there's only like 2 properties I know of that are stuck in that RR situation. So writing a whole code around 2 properties is not what we usually do. And then I'm reluctant to expose us to the Measure 49 claims and getting into medical and RR. And then when we look at some of the EFU and F1 stuff, I've actually had growers say, could there be a process to eliminate the 100-foot buffer if you own both properties? Because they're losing land, valuable grow land, if they own adjacent parcels. Because it's property line, they have to have a 100-foot setback by the way our rules are written. So I've even had pushback about the 100-foot setback, let alone going to 1,000. Yeah, so the reasonable test there, and then, in the background of all this, I have in my mind the Attorney General of the United States pulling back rules that were in place under the last administration, and there's great questions about whether this whole experiment of states having their own regulation over this industry and allowing it to become more legal is going to continue in that direction. So there's a whole question of, banking industries and everything else that's really up in the air right now. So as I read your memo and understand the situation, I hope folks out there read it also, because I think it clearly kind of defines things like the timeline of when medical marijuana came into being, and the fact that we were prohibited from regulating the grow portion, and then when the reasonable restrictions came into being and that time gap, and then you explain the Measure 49 implications. That's important for the public to understand and understand how much that ties our hands in ability to regulate that, even though that is my number 1 complaint on marijuana is actually medical grows in residential neighborhoods. By far my heaviest complaint and probably most bothersome complaint, because it's sort of been shown, I won't say all medical growers are this way, but 80% of the black market diversion in Oregon is coming out of medical, according to the state police, a leaked memo out of the state police, which means if those folks are willing to divert to black market with marijuana, they're usually dealing other things. So those complaints about traffic, seeing people brandishing weapons, everything else that goes, the behavior stuff that comes along with some of these medical grows, on marijuana grows, on the medical side, it's even worse, and it's in the neighborhood. So you take all that stuff and focus it into a residential neighborhood. So that's where, but I'm hoping maybe with the seed to sale and maybe some of the views, if there's change over time, that may come under control by itself. But I don't know how, under our current legal structure in the state, we can deal with that without exposing ourselves to a huge unfunded liability.
So do you have your instructions?
Yeah, which is do nothing. Commissioner Williams, I know you had wanted to get in the queue after me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be fairly brief. First of all, thank you for a really comprehensive document here. I'll read it a little bit at a time at night, and sometimes it really helps and sometimes not so much. But, and I'd also like to extend my thanks to Land Management Division. I was probably a nightmare for you in August and September. I called you just about every day with a new marijuana issue, and but that also illustrates just how big an issue this is. And we've heard here at Harris Hall people that have great concerns. Kind of pine for the day when quality of life was basically a function of good neighbors. And so where we're at now is neighbors not being very considerate of those around them. The big picture here is probably, if there's going to be any kind of fix to this, it lies with the legislature. But we do have a couple things that we can do and do, and that's the mitigating generator noise and light pollution. Those are things that I believe we can control at the county level, and so that to me was. I didn't get complaints about lights, but I did get complaints about generator noise, which really was very frustrating. You can't do anything about the odor, and odor is one of those things that some people like certain smells and some people can't stand it. Can't wear perfume or a cologne in an elevator without probably causing somebody's sinuses to explode. But when I was in college in California, in the San Jose area, Gilroy, the garlic capital of the world, was just downwind. But every time that wind would shift, usually about 8 o'clock in the morning when I was walking to work, man, it smelled like some really good spaghetti going on somewhere. So I get that. But I also heard a lot of people complaining about, oh, man, that garlic's about to choke me up. So these are just observations. There's not anything other than I just wanted to thank Council for this great document and this body of work. And I wanted to thank Land Management for being patient with me and really being the go-to source when I can explain a little bit to the citizens that's calling me, pass those folks on to you, and there's always a great and quick response and kind of gets my feet out of the fire. And so with that, I give thanks to you folks at the table, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. So any further discussion or direction for staff? I think I heard a clear direction to keep our powder dry. Is that sound like a reasonable summation? We all understand the complexities involved here and the liabilities and the uncertainties of reasonable Measure 49 and everything else that comes along with regulating this, and the balance too. There's one side's pushing for looser control and another side's pushing for tighter control.
And as soon as we get that decision from Deschutes County, we'll send it out to the board. So you're aware that it's come out and you'll have an opportunity to review it.
I appreciate that. I just love reading LUBA decisions. Hazeldale was just a thrill of a read.
I wonder what you do with all those briefs and opinions that I send you.
I actually read quite a few of them. What I do in front of the TV at night. Multitasking. Thank you for your time. I know that, once again, this is, an example of when did we make this assignment? Back last October or
September, October.
September, October. So it's just coming before the board now here in January. Months later, 1,000-page document. So when we start getting into things that impact the law, whether it's election law or land use law, sometimes it can be a pretty complex analysis that has to be done before we can look at making decisions. And in this case, it's kind of like we're basically coming to the understanding that we really don't have very much we can do at this point. We're fortunate we took the action we did when we did at the beginning of recreational, so we do have some time, place, and manner in effect. Because if we had waited, then we'd have been exposing ourselves not only to the issue of reasonableness, it would also be the issue of Measure 49. So I want to thank my fellow commissioners and land management and legal counsel, because I remember that was quite a hurry up and get it across the finish line effort to get those in place prior to recreational being legalized rather than after. And that was a heavy lift, and I'm really glad we did that much. Wish we had done more, 20/20 hindsight, but that's,
And what I was going to suggest to the board is I will send each one of you the separate PDF, which is attachment 1, which is just the memorandum, because that is the kind of, you're free.
Yeah,
of
it's
course,
hard to
send-
open the 1,000 pages.
Correct. But and I understand that. And I think for your constituents that is really for someone who wants to get sort of the nickel version in the background, that will accomplish it. And that way you have it in a PDF, it's easy. And I'll be sure and put the date of this hearing in the subject line so that you can also reference that when you do it. So they have an opportunity, if they want to go back and watch this, they can.
Great, this work session. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time and all that effort. I know it seems like all that for don't do anything.
Appreciate the discussion. Thank you, commissioners.
So that gets us through, and we got to go back to a couple items we skipped. And the first one I want to jump back to is county administration announcements.
I don't have anything too pressing, Mr. Chair, just a couple things I think I'd mentioned last week. I had the opportunity to do a presentation to the Oregon Assessors and Tax Collectors Conference, annual conference in Sun River. Human Resources and County Council and myself did a presentation on the 2017 strike, our labor negotiations, and the AFSCME strike that happened. And so that was really well received. Obviously, counties around the state were interested in that effort. We've been asked by a number of other statewide agencies to do similar presentations on that. There's also the, you may be familiar with the International City County Management Association, ICMA, which is my peer national association, and they're starting up a blog, a regular blog called Ask a Manager. And so they've are familiar with a number of things happening in Lane County around employee health insurance and labor negotiations and mental health and public safety collaborations, leadership development. And so they've asked for us to participate in that effort and share some of the things that we're doing here with our peers around the country. So some good things there just in terms of networking and information sharing about positive work happening here in Lane County. That's all I have. Just a couple brief things, unless you have questions for me, Mr. Chair.
So one quick question. Eventually, I think I asked this the last time you reported on the January 23rd election, that when you have a chance to pull together how much that cost the county, I'm interested in what that number is. Doesn't have to be right down to the penny, but if we can start getting a ballpark.
For the statewide election last week, and we are in the process of gathering that, and we will provide it to you once we have an update.
Thank you. So that brings us down to commissioners' business announcements. Any announcements from the commissioners? Quiet group. I will announce that I am actually going to take a tour of a marijuana production facility.
Field trip.
A field trip tomorrow. Terrapin Care Station folks out on Woodruff in Eugene asked me to come look at their operations and take a tour. I believe Doug Barber was the one that contacted me, former television reporter, I think, acting as doing some PR work for them. So I'll try and take notes, Commissioner Sorensen, and report back to you of what modern marijuana cultivation, because all I kind of remember was my older brother pulling some seeds out of one of his bags and trying to grow it in a closet. But
No,
I think it's changed since then.
I remember growing up in coastal counties, Commissioner Sorensen, a lot of people were tripping in fields. I don't know if we were.
Yeah.
That counts as field tripping.
Yeah. So I'll report back on that that tour. Any other commissioners' announcements? So that brings us to agenda team requests. Any agenda team requests from the commissioners?
I do.
Commissioner Farr.
You know, we have the work session that we have discussed for subsequent to the sometime in June. I believe there's enough interest in just the discussion of what is Oregon's initiative process and what is lawful and what is not lawful, what is and what historically has happened with the initiative process. I think we could all benefit from that, and I think the public could benefit from the board discussing that in a I'm reluctant to use the word work session, but that just an information session regarding what is the initiative process and what is Oregon law and what can people do. What is legal for people to do. So I'm really interested in getting that out. I think some of the people who are calling for us to do a work session that were this morning, I think, are asking us to write an ordinance, which isn't that simple. But discussing what is the current existing Oregon law is a little bit more cut and dried and a little bit more simple. So that is my request.
So I'll jump in here for a minute and say that I don't object to the idea of having a work session around, what is the state of initiative law in the state of Oregon, and particularly how it applies here in Home Rule County, particularly relative to charter amendments, ordinances, referral powers of the county. What I do not want to get into discussing, and at least I'm going to ask the board to think about either canceling or changing the May 23rd placeholder work session we talked about last time, is, Commissioner Sorensen, there's something you said last time that stuck with me a little bit, and it's one of the reasons why I made the statement I did today, which was we should tell them just one way or another whether, we're going to refer an ordinance to the ballot. And the two particular things they're asking us to refer an ordinance on, at least from my reading, without getting 1,000 pages worth of legal analysis that would take us the 4 months like this last work session item did, I know both of them violate state law. And you can't get around the fact that we're preempted from regulating ag practices. You can't get around the fact that we can't adopt an ordinance that says we're exempt from state law because we're a subdivision of the state, and that's what the Community Rights Initiative basically does. So knowing that, I could tell you now, if you want me to decide on the facts I have today, whether I would refer an ordinance or not, I can say it's not worth holding a work session on referring those two specific ordinances, because I can tell you today I would not do that. You wanted me to, and I also think we're doing a disservice to the folks that are interested in that, because they still have the right to collect signatures and refer it and put it on the ballot themselves, and then it doesn't have to go through that test. If we're taking the action, then we have to be concerned about whether we're willfully violating laws. And that's when it gets right down to it. So my statement earlier today about remanding retracting my support for a work session is about not wanting to lead those folks on and giving them a definitive answer now. That basically, if you're not going to give us time to do, and I think even after that legal analysis, it's going to come out the same. That there's nothing scheduled in this legislative session to take apart the Right Farm and Forest Act, and we'll still be preempted from local regulation of ag practices, not to mention the fact that we don't have a county Department of Agriculture to do the regulation, but that's neither here nor there. If you want a clear answer, that's the best answer I can give you if you're not going to give us a lot of time. And even if we had that time, it's pretty sure that it's going to not go the way that these people are requesting us to do. And the other side of that is they have made it fairly clear in their memo that this is a political issue for them. And then we get into the case of helping a politically minded group of people to place, if we're doing a referral, we're helping them shortcut the signature gathering process by utilizing public funds of our board, our staff, and everything else to refer something to ballot that is a definitive political issue, and is that treading a little bit close to that whole issue of expending public funds for a political purpose or not. It's probably not quite, but it's close, and it kind of gives me a little bit of the heebie-jeebies. So between those couple of things, I think we need to give those folks a definitive answer, or they're going to come back and say, why aren't you holding the work session again? Why didn't you hold it sooner? Even if we schedule it, it's kind of like they're looking for us to give them that answer. And I'm willing to give them that answer today, which is as I see it, there's no way for me to legally expose the county in defending us, and then ultimately, because I think they would lose defending us, me being personally liable for having placed something on the ballot that's going to cause, up to several $1 million for folks to run campaigns on, and then ultimately rack up, hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal fees, taking it to court to get it overturned once it's, if it does get passed. If it doesn't get passed, we might be liable from both sides for campaign costs. I'm not, I can tell you today, it's a non-starter for me. And answer your question that you asked last week. So rather than put it out 4 months, let's have that conversation today. Are we going to hold a work session on those referrals, or are we going to hold a work session and information on the status of current, initiative law and that's sort of where I'd like us to have a little bit of a discussion today.
Thank you.
Maybe I'm the only person that's at this point of decision.
So back to my request, it really is, we've sat here accused of preempting public process. I don't believe we have preempted public process, but I'd like to have a work session to discuss what is the public process, and is there any preemption that has occurred. I don't think we need to talk about the preemption. Let's just talk about the public process and then really answer that question, because it's not, Mr. Mukherjee, it's not very easy to sit here being accused of things that I'm pretty darn sure I did not do. Yeah. And it's not very easy for me to stay quiet while those people are looking at me in the eye and saying that I'm malfeasant when I'm not. So that's why I want to have a work session on this, is to discuss what is the public process and where do we fit in the public process, and settle it once and for all that we put a vote out on the West Eugene Parkway 2 times. And the people said yes 2 times, and the city council killed it, even after people said yes twice. So that's a part of the public process, and we need to just know what the public process is and what is our part in it, and make certain that we are not being malfeasant and not shunting or short-stopping the public process.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Well, I think we have 2 things going on here, so I'll just address the first one, and that is whether we should have a work session on the initiative process and how it works. I'm okay with that. As far as the referral issue, I think we have a different topic, but just to stay on the topic that was introduced.
That's a third head nod.
I think that, to me, that's a good idea. It's always a good idea. I think on the other topic, I don't know what to say. I thought last week we agreed on doing a work session on a referral.
On May 23rd.
So if we have 3 head nods on it, I'd like to push that a little bit and make it as soon as possible. I think we're down on is it the 20th that we're down? But I'd like to have the work session on the initiative process prior to that.
And maybe, Mr. Chair, so I saw head nods for a work session to discuss the initiative process. Just a little bit of clarity, maybe this is what Mr. Dingell has wanted to come up here for, on what exactly you would, so that we're prepared to come back. I imagine we're going to want to have our clerk, Cheryl Betchard, here talk about that, and we'll do some legal analysis as well.
Chair Bozovich, members of the board, yes, and it's important to understand, especially Commissioner Farr, currently there is a dispute about what the initiative process involves. Okay, so what I will tell you is, if you have, at least with respect to what it means by the rules that bind us in Lane County, what Judge Rasmussen rules will have a huge impact on that. Because if you ask me what the initiative process is, I'm going to give you one answer. Now, if the proponents come in, they're going to tell you that the initiative process is something completely different. So I just want to make you aware of that. That is the crux of the issue with Judge Rasmussen right now. The petitioners take the position that there should be no review, no substantive review of charter amendments or compliance with the separate vote requirement. That is essentially their fundamental position. Judge Rasmussen, I believe, has ruled to the contrary. So when I think we can all agree on certain processes, like, for example, I don't think there's any dispute that, as Chair Bozovich mentioned, that citizens have the right to propose a clearly unconstitutional initiative measure. That's perfectly permissible. You can vote on it, and then if it ever gets applied, and the court will review the constitutionality of it. That is different from an ordinance. So I just want to make sure that the board understands that. I would really recommend, if you're going to have that work session on just the initiative process, that you would wait until Judge Rasmussen rules, because otherwise I'll be giving you two different answers about what the initiative process is or might be in Lane County, which I don't think is very helpful to anybody. If you're looking for a definitive answer. And the other thing is some of the issues that have been raised, specifically Commissioner Farr, I, for the life of me, do not know where this view that the board is somehow involved in this process comes from. This is based on a state statute passed by the Oregon legislature, not the Board of Commissioners, and a ruling from a Lane County Circuit Court judge directing our clerk to do something.
Who pays the circuit court judge's salary?
Now, that would be the state of Oregon.
Thank you.
So I mean, so literally, this board has absolutely no role in that decision. So where the idea comes that the board is responsible for Judge Rasmussen's ruling or that statute, I don't know. And again, I believe his ruling will, last time he did a 15-page opinion, I expect that he'll do another thorough analysis. I think it would be very useful to have that in your hands and as something to discuss when we're talking about what the initiative process is in Lane County.
Then I'll be a little bit clear on what it is I'd like to achieve. You're pointing out there is a certain amount of ambiguity, particularly as it concerns the single
separate vote.
Separate vote, excuse me. But there is no ambiguity as to what the board's role is. And so what I would like to be able to state at the end of the day is I have not done anything to circumvent the initiative process. I want to be able to say that because that's what I think. And if I'm thinking something that's incorrect, I want to be called out on it.
Well,
and I don't want to sit here and listen to 30 people accusing me of doing something wrong when I haven't. And there's no way I'm going to sit here and debate them in this room in this venue as to whether or not I've done something wrong, unless we have an absolute definitive. The board has not done anything wrong and has not circumvented the initiative process at any time. It could be. We could talk about some of the initiatives that have been successful in getting on the ballot. We could talk about Measure 50. We could, whatever it may be. We could talk about how initiatives got on the ballot, and then we can talk about any historical separate vote initiatives that didn't make it to the ballot. And this is why it didn't make it to the ballot. And so to me, while there may be some ambiguity and we're waiting for Judge Rasmussen's decision, there are certain things that aren't ambiguous. And I'm sick and tired. I am sick and tired of being called out by this group of people for doing something wrong that I've not done wrong.
Well, and I've tried in every venue that I've been to try and explain that the sequence of events are that statute was passed by the Oregon legislature in 1983, that a private citizen brought a lawsuit against our clerk alleging that she had violated her duties. Everybody went to court. The county went to the court. The petitioners went to the court. The interveners went to the court. Everybody had an opportunity to argue their position, and a neutral judge ruled that Cheryl Betchart had a legal obligation, if and when the requisite number of signatures were verified, to review the measure for compliance with the separate vote requirement. Period. The board had out. It's like arguing a negative. I don't know how you say it any differently. And like I said, one of the things I'm going to do when I argue this to Judge Rasmussen on Friday is to encourage him to bring clarity to that, because I know that there are certain phrases that have been taken out of his opinion by, for example, Ms. Neeland, and have said that have been used as a justification for the clerk to do nothing. And again, when I say, well, when I look at the last line that says it is hereby ordered in capital letters, and the third thing on that list is for her to make a review, to me, it's not very ambiguous. She was told that if one of these measures was presented to her and she verified the requisite number of signatures, then she had an obligation to review it for compliance with the separate vote requirement.
And the work session that I'm calling for allows us to make that statement. As we sit in a public session, we can't have a debate and make a statement, so people, one after another, after another, after another, can make accusations without a rebuttal.
And like
so this would be a rebuttal of sorts.
That's fine.
Yeah, the reason I favor the work session on the initiative is because it's very clear that the board plays little or no role at all in initiatives. It's whether or not the board sets the tone for the organization, whether there's a website that tells people how to start the initiative process, educates them, points them to the Secretary of State's office for guidance, clarifies all the rules. The rules are not clear. That's why there's a lawsuit going on. The rule, in my view, that's why there's a lawsuit. That's why there's an intervener in the lawsuit. So you have the government as an entity with a role in the initiative process, i.e. to hold the election and determine if it's in compliance with the rules. You have the petitioners who have a lot of requirements they have to do, and you have the rights of other people who those rights have to be protected. So I'm in favor of having this work session on initiatives, but if nothing else, the current litigation will clarify what it is people have to do. I don't want to get that confused with any referrals by the Oregon legislature. Measure 50 was a referral. You know, our measure to fund to get the voters to fund the jail and the youth services, that's a referral. So referral power is a completely different one, a different power, and I just think they ought to be kept separately. And I agree. You know, let's have a work session on how do you have an initiative, and what is the role of the government in the initiative, and what's the role of the intervener that doesn't like the initiatives? Let's explore how that works so it's not a mystery. But to me, that is a separate issue from a referral.
Measure 50 was an expensive referral that corrected a faulty Measure 47 initiative.
And Chair Bozovich and Commissioner Sorensen, what I would say is to your last point, my observation, and it's ironic that you should bring this up, Ms. Betchart is excellent, and there are excellent resources. As a matter of fact, yesterday, she, for the other charter amendment regarding the different voting system, star voting, those folks came to her and asked, we want to start circulating petitions. Who can circulate petitions? Right? And so they were trying, and so she sent me a memo from the Department of Justice. Long short of it is, she gave very clear direction and pointed it to pointed them to the rules. So, and I can tell you from answering questions from her all along the way, she is scrupulous about giving people advice and seeking out the answers. So, and this is one where it's not her decision. She's saying, look, I've got a court that tells me I'm supposed to do this. You're telling me I'm not supposed to do it. I'm obviously going to listen to the court. But she does, to your point, she does a very good job of, and those folks were right to do that. They wanted to do things right. They showed up and said, we are going to start circulating petitions. Our first question is, what if any, are the requirements for an individual circulating a petition? Because we want to comply with them.
Commissioner Lincoln.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I made some statements today, and I think they're about as clear as they were. Very, very, very clear. So here's my general thoughts here, and I go back to my time as mayor. You're a board chair as mayor, so I'm going to say conservatively, I chaired 2,000 meetings, and I bring that up for a specific reason. First of all, I've never been involved in a work session where you have outside group not involved, who are not part of staff, that actually bring forth pertinent information so we can make a decision. I've not been involved in one. We never had that at the city of Springfield, and I can say I don't recall one. Maybe I'm wrong, but after all those years, I don't. The second piece is this. Mr. Dingell has given us very, very sage advice. And I remember Mr. Leahy, while I was mayor, giving very, very sage advice. You either listen to it or you don't. And if you don't, you're likely to potentially make a mistake somewhere along the line. I think the sage advice here is this, and that is no matter what we want to discuss, we should wait until after we hear from Judge Rasmussen. We're talking another month or so, all right? Maybe a little longer, maybe 6 weeks, I don't know. But the reality is, I think, and as Steve, as you mentioned earlier, I think a lot of questions will be answered. I'm not opposed to having a work session. I'm not even opposed to having a work session regarding the initiatives. But the one thing that again, that seems to get lost in this whole conversation about the ordinance of the initiative the group is proposing is there's a preemption. There's a state preemption on local government. And I think Chair Bozovich mentioned, we do not have a Department of Ag here at Lane County. And so this is where things get completely off the tracks. And as far as folks coming in and yeah, I mean, I get kind of tired of it. Some of the poems are kind of funny, and you know, some of the songs are interesting, and but there's a couple folks that come in here with, I think their intentions are absolute, and you can kind of see it. They truly believe what the intentions are. I don't degrade them, nothing else. I let them speak. I hear them out. I don't recall Mr. Dickinson coming and threatening and doing all sorts of things. I think he has his issues, and he's a strong, strong believer in what he believes in. Ms. Klusman from Springfield's the same thing. I've talked to her privately, and I think her intentions are real. The challenge that we face is the law. And so I strongly believe we just, no matter what we decide to do today, the sage advice is we wait until Judge Rasmussen has made his ruling. And I think that is very, very important. I think it'll clear up a lot of things for us. And then we can make decisions on the work session. Again, you know, I'm not surprised that the date, you know, became set in stone when we really talked. In fact, I think during the last week, I think we talked about it as being nothing more than a placeholder. I think the word placeholder was actually mentioned for the May debate, or potential May work session. So that was a placeholder date. We didn't know, and we still don't know. So my thought here is, I think it's very prudent and wise for us to wait until Judge Rasmussen rules. That's the advice that's coming from County Council. I think it's good advice. And then we can circle back around and make a decision on how we want to do this, and as far as the work session is concerned, and go through the issue of legalities. I'm already aware that I've had absolutely nothing to do with this. And if folks want to still point fingers, they're going to point fingers no matter what. It won't matter. The fingers will be pointed, period. Conversation over with. Even though the board has had no issue, no piece of this at all. And then one last thing, and I've reiterated this several times, there was an advantage of running for Secretary of State, even though I got plastered, but there was an advantage, because the advantage was you get to talk to other clerks. And to the one, they said the same thing. You have one of the best clerks in the state of Oregon. You have one of the best clerks in the state of Oregon. That's saying something. When other counties around the state say that over and over again. Cheryl Betchart is one of the very best clerks in the state of Oregon, and that comes from her peers. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And if I could, I just wanted to make sure I was clear about what I was saying. The hearing is this Friday, and I believe the last time that Judge Rasmussen had his opinion out in 2 or 3 weeks, and you only have 2 more board meetings, or you only have 2 board meetings, and because you have a down week in February. So all I'm saying is I think that if you I would we've made it clear that and I have no reason to believe that Judge Rasmussen won't honor this. Ms. Betchart has asked him to give her a decision ahead of the March 15th cutoff date. So I have every expectation that Judge Rasmussen is going to would issue a decision at the latest a week or so before the 15th to give Ms. Betchart time to digest it and apply it, so that she can proceed given that March 15th deadline. So I didn't mean to say you should wait until the opinion comes out to do it. If you wanted to set that, I was trying to give you, I should have been more clear. I apologize. I honestly believe that Judge Rasmussen will rule before the first of the month in March.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Chair. You know, we've sat up here and we've listened to a lot of folks who are pretty infuriated at us. I believe there's more of a political agenda here than anything else, which revolves around aerial spraying. The other stuff, I think, is secondary in their minds. And I don't know how many phone calls and emails that have come to me. I believe probably more than the others have gotten. Don't mind being singled out as a really bad guy amongst otherwise just bad guys. But I find it really annoying that when I would respond to the emails that weren't dropping F-bombs and some of those things, that they really didn't care about legality. They care about their political agenda and this item of aerial spraying. That's what they care about. And when I would explain to them that this is before Judge Rasmussen and I will not have a comment about this until the judge has had a ruling following county counsel's advice. I've never gone against my attorney's advice as a mayor or certainly here. There are some things that you just do and some things you don't do and don't go against counsel. So having said all that, it's irritating to have people repeatedly say the same thing week after week after week from the same individuals, sending the same emails and the same voicemails, and indicating that somehow this body is at fault in depriving folks of their right to petition. They don't care how many times you tell them that that's not the case, that doesn't lie with us. They don't care. They still come back and blame us for interfering in the process. So I just wanted to vent a great deal of frustration that I have, but the people that we've heard from week after week don't care about the facts. They don't care a lot about the truth. Being called a fascist today, you know, I've been in public service for nearly 20 years, and it's the first time in those 20 years I've been called a fascist. I sat with a colleague on city council one time, and somebody called him Hitler, which was kind of a crazy thing for anybody, any decent person, to get up and call a public volunteer names like that. But I find that patently offensive, and it discredits all those people that are pure in heart and believe this stuff, that they're not here being rude and, dare I say, ugly and using foul language. I'm not going to respond to them until I've heard from Judge Rasmussen on his ruling. I'm following your advice, Mr. Dingell, and I guess that's enough said. Jay.
So before I go to you, Pete, I just want to, having done agenda setting this morning, the agenda is pretty well set for next week, and we're juggling time certains and everything else on that day. Although, and we have a time certain executive session in the afternoon at 1:30, because and it's going to be a fairly lengthy exec session. We could come out of executive session for something after that. The following week, I believe we're down And then the next week, it doesn't look terribly crowded, but I do know the week of the 27th and 28th, we were looking and thinking that was a very full Bullard day right now, because it has the unfortunate convergence of a bunch of land use stuff in the afternoon. So the afternoon's packed, and there were multiple items in the morning, one of which was estimated at 90 minutes. So, which is the strategic plan, but whether that ends up moving around. So that week of the 27th is really full right now. So just keep that as we're discussing future agenda dates. I just wanted to put that in your heads.
I'm just curious on a topic kind of related to both the referral and the initiative. Are the same rules in effect for the board on referrals as on the public for initiatives? Are there substantial differences, and maybe that's the topic for the work session?
I'm always, Chair Bozovich, Commissioner Sorensen, I got to tell you, I'm always a little confused by the language. The way I read 203-725 sub 2, which is the statute that's at issue in the ballot qualification language, and I'm going to argue Friday, says that if it's a charter amendment, before it's, per Judge Rasmussen's ruling, before it's put to the voters, it needs to be reviewed. I read that as if it's a citizen-led initiative, that event is triggered when the clerk is presented with the petition and verifies the requisite number of signatures. I would say that if this board were to refer a charter amendment, that referral would trigger the same review. In other words, I don't think there's a way to avoid the 203-725 sub 2 separate vote review.
What about if it's a referral of an ordinance?
Well, that's the 203-725 sub 2 only applies to charter amendments. But then that triggers, of course, the whole other different type. I mean, as we said, when the board if the board were to refer an initiative, we wouldn't talk about whether or not it was constitutional or, whether or not it was, none of those things. But obviously an ordinance is a different animal because, again, you can't pass unconstitutional ordinances, for example, right? And so my expectation would be that the process for considering referring an ordinance would be the same one that you do with any other ordinance, at least with respect to my role. I assume I'd get the same sort of questions. Is this legal? Do we have liability? All the usual questions that you've done time and time again, having served on the board a long time. So again, that's a very thumbnail, short take on it, but. And the only reason I'm able to do it with that degree of clarity is just because of the involvement I've had with this last ruling, because I have been doing some prep this week for that argument.
Okay. We are also down the first week of March also for NACO. So I'm still hearing I haven't heard anyone say let's not have a work session on the initiative process. I've kind of heard that don't really need one to know that you haven't interfered, but I haven't heard anyone. I've heard 3 head nods say okay with having that work session. I'm trying to figure out when, which also kind of sort of includes you being able to at least put something together staff-wise, which you guys don't have any other assignments in your office. There's no other lawsuits going on, labor negotiations or land use issues or code rewrites. Nothing else that's going on in the county council's office.
Mr. Chair, we talked about March 13th. Seems like it'd be a date that would be feasible to bring back a discussion regarding the initiative process generally. And then the second question is, the direction you want to provide. We did a placeholder for May 23rd. It was not confirmed but there is a placeholder out there for that one. So if you'd like us to change direction on that, then let us know.
And I think I can be, the good news about that March date that Steve just mentioned is I am confident with 100% certainty that we'll have Judge Rasmussen's ruling, and I am confident I can have the material ready for you by then. So it seems like that is an ideal date in the sense of the already full agendas and the down weeks. So, but again, I'll do whatever the board asks.
I'm certain we will hear that we should have scheduled it sooner. Because we haven't brought the right rock yet. Sorry, that's the old joke about bring me a rock. So,
March 13th?
Yeah, March 13th for a work session on the initiative process, the roles of the board, and the status of state and county law relative to that process. And I think that'll be educational for some people, because I think one of the things that's been confused and conflated a lot, at least in the public's eye, is the difference between a board referral and a citizen initiative, and how those are looked at differently under the law, and the difference between an ordinance and a charter amendment also has been greatly confused. And those four terms have got a lot of people not understanding, because there's several combinations of those four terms, and depending on which of those terms you put together changes what rules apply. Mm-hmm. You know, whether it's a citizen-led initiative to amend the charter, or whether it's a county commission referral of an ordinance, there's different processes.
And then there's a direct initiative and the indirect initiative. And really, that's kind of, I think, where they're leaning, is they're trying to do an indirect initiative. So, yeah.
And what I'm going to do, I'll just be very direct. I've listened to, if not all, but at least I think 98% of the public testimony, and I'm going to try, my goal, unless I get some different direction from you, is to try and answer those and untangle those, because I do see people, I know people don't like attorneys, but we do use words with precision, and they mean very specific things. And again, as the chair has just pointed out, they have very different consequences. So I will try very hard to come up with all of the permutations of the things that, and if I understand correctly, someone, give me different direction. But what I hear is write this memorandum from the perspective of what, if any, role the board has in initiatives, or potential role the board has in initiatives. And if so, what are the rules surrounding that? And I think if we do that, that will cover, and it's not just, and I'm going to cover not just initiative charter amendments, but also ordinances. And I think if we put all those different permutations together, I think that'll answer all the questions.
Thanks.
Does that generally sound what the board is looking for?
As long as it's reasonable.
Yeah. And it may also be helpful to walk through the timeline of those two specific initiatives and the fact and what actions were taken. Okay. Because I think there was a mention of setting tone. County staff, through the clerk, actually approved these initiatives for circulation, and then a third party sued. Yep. Oh, county staff allowed the signatures to be collected, and a third party, that's at every step of the way where there was, a county staff decision, we actually had approved them moving forward until it got to the point where we had to do a separate vote analysis. And that's the first time anybody in the county has done anything that could be considered, negative towards these initiatives. So, maybe just a walk through that timeline so people understand where they're, and that was action taken at the order of a judge. It wasn't action initiated by county staff. So, I heard Commissioner Sorensen say something about setting the tone and all that stuff. I don't think there's anyone on this board that doesn't believe in the initiative process. I think we've all participated in it at one point or another. I've circulated signatures before. And I understand those rules. In fact, that's kind of interesting talking about where you go to get the rules. It's like, oh, there's a pamphlet about this thick on initiative petitions and the rules for signature gatherers and things like you can't leave them on the counter of a business unattended because if anyone signs while it's unattended, those are not valid signatures. All those crazy things. So it'd be good to kind of just maybe remind people of that, where there has been decisions and in the process, and in the process has got some statutory things like we had to review for when they turned in signatures, we had so many days to verify whether they had enough or not and report back to the petitioners. And did we meet that statutory requirement? Yes. Every place along the way, with the exception of where we were ordered to do something by a judge, we've actually been helping this initiative move through the process, both initiatives. So,
and just one last point of personal privilege. Mr. Mokrohysky, gerrymandering is a word that putting Glenwood in Springfield isn't gerrymandering. Putting Ferry Street Bridge in Eugene is not gerrymandering. Putting Brownsville and the University of Oregon in the same legislative district, that is gerrymandering.
Yeah. Well, and it was interesting that, there was a point where there were places in the East Lane district that were west of Walton. And, fixing that, and saying you've got switched from west to east, after all that time, it's like, hey, yeah, if you lived out near Walton, you might have. Because that's the way the lines were before 2011. So, oh well, that's enough said. Yeah, it is. I will apologize if I became a little bit short this morning. I am working on 3.5 hours of sleep, and it is difficult to sit here and listen to people make one-sided accusations and not be responsive. And I understand that, it was even enough of a temptation to immediately respond by a couple commissioners this morning because it is very one-sided, particularly when you hear somebody very well having motivations assigned to them by somebody that does not know that person. And yes, Kevin Matthews, I'm talking about you giving motivations to Faye Stewart. That was hard to sit here and not interrupt. But, that's, neither here nor there. So we have marching orders for March the 13th for a work session on the initiative process only. We're not going to discuss referring ordinances or anything like that. For now, I guess we'll leave that May 23rd placeholder. I think we'd actually be doing those folks a service to give them a formal yes or no about that sooner rather than later. To me, waiting is actually being detrimental to their initiative rights and not giving them, you can go ahead and start your own process, marching orders, but that's, so far I'm the only one in that camp, so. Although sort of Commissioner Sorensen, because he was the one that brought it up last week. So with that, I think we're finished future agenda items, review of assignments. Been a long day.
I think we've covered that one.
Okay.
So I'm pretty clear on we'll target March 13th as a work session on the initiative process.
I don't think there was anything that came out of the disaster work session or the marijuana that had a future assignment. So with that, if there's no other business of the board, we are adjourned.